Hello, Mr. Fraser here, and this is another video guide to Duffy poetry, and this time we're focusing on one of my favourites in Mrs. Tilscher's class. So let's just kick off with a bit of context about this poem. If you're studying this at Higher or National 5, it helps to know the bit of context surrounding this poem and its creation. This is much like Originally and The Way My Mother Speaks, two other Duffy poems, in the sense that they are autobiographical, talking about Duffy's own experiences of moving from primary school, to secondary school, something which most of you can definitely empathise with. Duffy attended school in the 1960s, and that's important because there's a lot of nostalgic and historical references in this poem which really date it in that time period. For example, it mentions Brady and Hindley, and Brady and Hindley were mass murderers whose names were really synonymous with the 1960s in Great Britain at that time. They were responsible and guilty, convicted of the murder of many, many children. And so this idea of what they represent in society plays into this poem at quite a significant point, as you'll go and see. And even though it's quite a grim note, it's important that you know this for when their names pop up in this poem. So let's start with the first stanza. You could travel up the blue Nile with your finger, tracing the route while Mrs. Tilscher chanted the scenery. Tana, Ethiopia, Khartoum, Aswan. That for an hour, then a skittle of milk, and the chalky pyramids rubbed into dust. A window opened with a long pole, the laugh of a bell swung by a running child. Now, before we go into specific annotations, just another reminder that, as always, these are just my annotations. It's by no means complete, and if I am not your English teacher, it may very well be that your English teacher has gone over different annotations and highlighted different things in different ways, and that's fine. It's poetry. There's no one right answer. This is just simply intended to be a guide to your studies. So starting off with stanza 1, my annotations look a little bit like this, and we start off with this long and flowing sentence describing this idea that you could travel up the blue Nile with your finger, tracing the route while Mrs. Tilscher chanted the scenery. And isn't it wonderful that we see a long and flowing sentence being used to describe something which is in and of itself long and flowing, that of course being the River Nile, which Mrs. Tilscher is telling the children all about as they watch captivated. And we start to get our first glimpse of Tilscher's character with that word choice of chanted. Mrs. Tilscher chanted the scenery. The chanting to me is something which has connotations of music, maybe magic. It's something quite special. She's not just dryly going Tana, Ethiopia, Khartoum, Aswan. She's chanting, and the children are very small and captivated as she's doing this. For them, it is almost like they are out on the River Nile, going through all these places within Africa. This word choice of chanted suggests an enjoyable rhythm to the lesson and recalls the recital style of teaching used at this time, very common in the 1960s. This is then followed up by a series of very, very small sentences, minor sentences in other words, mimicking the ideas of this chanting. So we've heard with the word choice that she's chanting, and then that is mimicked in the way that this line is delivered to us. Tana, full stop. Ethiopia, full stop. Khartoum, full stop. Aswan. So it's small individual sentences, and that gives it a certain rhythm, and it kind of complements this idea that Mrs. Tilscher, whilst being absolutely captivated by the children, is going through that scenery in a chanting style. Tana, Ethiopia, Khartoum, Aswan. You then get this idea of routine and comfort when it goes with that for an hour and then a skittle of milk. There's something so routine and warm and familiar about what happens in Mrs. Tilscher's primary school class. And I love to zone in on this idea of a skittle of milk. You've got a metaphor here because the milk itself isn't actually a skittle, but it resembles a skittle in a game of bowling or bowls. So rather than just say it was a bottle of milk, Duffy's gone on to say a skittle of milk. And of course, because it's from a game, skittle in this context has connotations of play and fun. So you do get this sense that in Mrs. Tilscher's class, the most ordinary things can be fun and captivating, and this happens again and again in the poem. It starts off with a skittle of milk, but it continues and continues throughout the first 2 stanzas at least. We then learn about the chalky pyramids being rubbed into dust, and what I'll say here, it's not on my annotations, is that there's something quite lovely here, that something so mighty and strong like a pyramid can just be wiped away and rubbed away. Of course, this is referring to a chalkboard or a blackboard that you would see in an old school vintage classroom, certainly in the 1960s. But the simplicity of it just being rubbed away is important, and that's something we'll come back to in stanza 2. We then learn about a window opened with a long pole, and it's not something that you see in every classroom nowadays, but it really dates this as a classroom of the 1960s. It was much more of an old school, primary school thing to see a big long pole used to open windows. And the idea of the window opening, I think, is important, and it's something that I'll come back to when we discuss the second stanza. But then look at that last line there. The laugh of a bell swung by a running child. Did Duffy ever write a more joyous line of her poetry? I'm not so sure that she did. So obviously with the laugh of a bell, what a positive phrase, and its personification. The school bell isn't just ringing, it's laughing. So much like the skittle of milk, the most mundane, ordinary things are brought to life, and they're almost magical. Something which just tends to always happen in Mrs. Tilscher's class. So it's not the ring of a bell, it's the laugh of a bell. Connotations of enjoyment, childhood wonder as well. And it's being swung by a running child, so it's very much a carefree environment. The child is running, and this time, unlike in War Photographer, the children aren't running in fear and desperation. Children are running in the way that we'd expect them to, because they're happy, because they're playing and having a great time. All in all, this is a very beautiful, nostalgic image of a very safe place for the young Caroline Duffy. And that, for the most part, continues into stanza 2. So let's go through stanza 2. This was better than home. Enthralling books, the classroom glowed like a sweet shop. Sugar paper, coloured shapes. Brady and Hindley faded like the faint, uneasy smudge of a mistake. Mrs. Tilscher loved you. Some mornings you found she'd left a good gold star by your name, the scent of a pencil slowly, carefully shaved. A xylophone's nonsense heard from another form. Okay, so getting into my annotations here then. I've divided this into two because there's just so much you can say about this stanza that it's going to take up over more than one slide. So starting off with the first half of my annotations here. I'm not ignoring this bottom section here. Start off with that first nice, short, straight to the point sentence. This was better than home. Well, it's been hinted in the first stanza, but if you had any doubt over how Duffy feels about Mrs. Tilscher's classroom, she adores it. And this is not her suggesting that she had a difficult home life or anything. No, she's just saying that Mrs. Tilscher's class was so wonderful, so captivating and so magical that she almost preferred it from home. It's undoubtedly I should say, better. And that instantly gets followed up with this short sentence here, enthralling books. What great word choice there. And much like the bell ringing and the skittle of milk, it's an ordinary object, a book. And if you're not much of a reader, books aren't that exciting. But for her, an everyday object like a book is exciting. Like the laugh of the bell, like the skittle of milk, the books are simply enthralling. This emphasises how much Duffy enjoyed school, and in particular its books. The word choice of enthralling has connotations of excitement and being totally absorbed by the book, giving the classroom again a magical quality. It develops again a theme of innocence, which you see recurring here, themes of innocence and growing up throughout this poem. Then what a wonderful simile that we have here. The classroom glowed like a sweet shop. It's obviously a reference to how primary school classrooms in particular are surrounded by colourful images, wall displays, sugar paper, coloured paper, things all over the place that make it very bright. So bright and colourful that in Duffy's estimation, it glows like a sweet shop. And of course, traditionally children love sweet shops. So by likening the classroom to something like that, it's again clear that she's very innocent, very sweet, and absolutely adores being in this class. And then what we have next is what seems to start off to be yet another lovely innocent list. It certainly starts off that way. Sugar paper, coloured shapes. It's all looking like we're going to get a third punchy ending to that list, like the power of 3. Sugar paper, coloured shapes, again listing these things off, very lovely language, very sweet, very colourful, but then out of nowhere we're hit with Brady and Hindley, the Moor murderers. Now, as I said at the top of the video, Brady and Hindley were real-life murderers who were arrested in the 1960s and imprisoned for the murder of many, many children. And we've just had a huge build-up of all this lovely positive imagery, and all of a sudden we're hit with Brady and Hindley. And look at how there's enjambment here. Enjambment is when a sentence falls over multiple lines, and the enjambment here lies at the very end. The line ends with Brady and Hindley, but the sentence continues. So Brady and Hindley are left isolated and emphasised. So it's really jarring for the reader who knows who Brady and Hindley were. You've had all this lovely imagery, and then all of a sudden, Brady and Hindley are mentioned. It's a very shocking contrast, and the enjambment serves to emphasise this. However, that one glimpse of darkness that we get is quickly dealt with. It's almost as if by opening the window with the long pole, the outside world was briefly exposed to the children. Brady and Hindley kind of snuck in the metaphorical sense, but very quickly, much like the chalky pyramids, Mrs. Tilscher can come in and save the day and wipe them away. But it's not quite as straightforward as getting rid of the chalky pyramids. Yes, they faded like the faint, uneasy smudge of a mistake. The faint, uneasy smudge of a mistake doesn't feel as smooth or clean as getting rid of the chalky pyramids in stanza 1. This time, they are erasing. It's successful, but it seems much more uncomfortable. Just look at the language. It's faint, uneasy, and it creates a smudge. These are kind of more negative examples of word choice here. So yes, Brady and Hindley kind of seep into their consciousness. Mrs. Tilscher can come in and sort of smudge out and get rid of it, but there's a little blotch that's remained, a little smudge, meaning that it's never quite away. And this is our first hint in the poem that there's maybe more darker ideas ahead. After all, Duffy, we assume at this point, is in primary 7, and secondary school and growing up is all ahead of her. So my annotations for that first half of stanza 2 take up one entire slide, so I'm going to shove these ones away and continue with additional annotations for the second half of stanza 2. So we then continue with this idea of Mrs. Tilscher loved you, and this is immediately following the Brady and Hindley suggestion, the mention of Brady and Hindley, and the idea that we just smudged them away. And it's almost as if we're having to be reassured again that Mrs. Tilscher, I should say, loved you. Right back to the original feelings of warmth and comfort from before. She loved you. Some mornings you found she'd left a good gold star by your name, and then the scent of a pencil slowly, carefully shaved. I love the sentence structure here. The adverbs slow down the pace of the sentence, complementing the slow action of gradually sharpening a pencil. I often read this as Duffy savouring that moment. Sharpening a pencil might be an ordinary thing, but much like the books, the laugh of a bell, the skittle of milk, these ordinary objects have much more magical meaning to her, and she savours them. So she doesn't just quickly sharpen a pencil, she does it slowly and carefully, enjoying the scent of it, because for her that just takes her right back to that sense of safety, something which, as we're soon going to learn, she's going to want to cling on to as her life gets a little bit darker and a little bit more uncertain. We also learn about a xylophone's nonsense, heard from another form. A xylophone, of course, being a musical instrument, and this idea of discordant nonsense in the distance, most of us tend to read it as just another image of the school life. It's chaotic, it's carefree, but in a very positive way. So overall, stanza 2 really continues the sweetness and the positivity and the innocence of stanza 1. But you do get, with the window opening in stanza 1, and then the mention of Brady Hindley all of a sudden out of the blue in stanza 2, this hint of something darker, something more adult, something more serious on its way. And these ideas are very much developed in stanzas 3 and 4. Over the Easter term, the inky tadpoles changed from commas into exclamation marks. 3 frogs hopped in the playground, freed by a dunce, followed by a line of kids jumping and croaking away from the lunch queue. A rough boy told you how you were born. You kicked him, but stared at your parents, appalled, when you got back home. So a lot of change in this third stanza. My annotations initially look a little bit like this. Let's go through them. So over the Easter term, we've got a turning point here telling us about the passage of time. We can imagine the kids have maybe been all the way on their Easter holidays, and they've all now come back ready for that final summer term. And this idea of change and of growth is continued with this next part of the sentence here, the inky tadpoles changing from commas into exclamation marks. Well, this is a metaphor, folks, because yes, the tadpoles are growing, but the metaphorical reference of them being commas to exclamation marks links them back to what the kids are doing in the classroom. And so just as the tadpoles are growing, so too are the kids. And it's that idea of the punctuation that really links the tadpoles growing into frogs to the kids and what they're going through. And that idea continues as this stanza continues, I should say. 3 frogs hopped in the playground, freed by a dunce. Just a quick bit of historical context. It's not something that we see in schools anymore, thankfully, but the word dunce refers to somebody who's very, very stupid, maybe reckless, and certainly in schools in the 1960s, if you were badly behaved, you'd be made to wear a cone hat with the big letter D on it. That was called the dunce's hat, and it goes back to a time where teachers would use humiliation as a tool of discipline, very much of its time. but it's quite negative word choice. Gone are the coloured shapes and the sugar paper and the classroom glowing like a sweet shop. We're getting much harsher language now, like the word dunce, and that continues with my next annotation. The boys are described as jumping and croaking. This starts to remind me of the bad boys and the big boys that are described in originally the Duffy poem. You get the same idea of this roughness and this coarseness coming from them. And let's not mistake that there's this use of the word croaking, which of course is referring to the noise that frogs make, but the fact that the boys are making those could be linked to the idea of voices breaking, again linking into the idea or the theme of growing up and impending change. There's more that you can say about this stanza, but I also just like to highlight the word appalled. Duffy is really shocked, and you need to understand that in the 1960s, sex education was not what it is now, and there was no access to the internet. There was really no scope for children to research these things on their own, as maybe there would be now. Duffy being told this as a wee primary 7 by a boy is very shocking to her, probably more shocking than it would be to a primary 7 nowadays, I speculate. But it absolutely shocks her to learn the truth about how babies are made. So when she goes home and looks at her parents, she is absolutely appalled. Very strong word choice. She stares at them, absolutely shocked, and notice there's enjambment there of the word stared. It's sticking out and hanging off at the end, maybe to suggest her prolonged stare. She's just kind of gobsmacked, totally looking at them. Her innocence is being corrupted with this knowledge. Final stanza. That feverish July, the air tasted of electricity. A tangible alarm made you always untidy, hot, fractious under the heavy, sexy sky. You asked her how you were born, and Mrs. Tilscher smiled, then turned away. Reports were handed out. You ran through the gates, impatient to be grown, as the sky split into a thunderstorm. So this final stanza, this is what my annotations look like for it. Start off with that word choice of feverish, suggests being quite uncomfortable, feeling a wee bit unpleasant, and she is really on the precipice of growth and of leaving primary school. She's had all these hints of the big bad, more mature world, with the mention of Brady and Hindley, with all these images of growth and puberty, and it's really all coming to a head here. The air tasted of electricity, suggesting maybe a sense of excitement, but maybe a sense of tension and unease as well. The children may be agitated, excited for the summer. There's a new energy and excitement, but there's also a sense of the destructive nature. It's not quite positive, it's not quite negative, it's kind of in flux and in between those ideas. A tangible alarm made you always untidy, hot, fractious. So notice the contrast now between the laughing bell of the first stanza to now a tangible alarm. Tangible is something that is so real you can actually touch it. And so it's a bit of a contrast. It's more alarming than the laugh of a bell. Things have changed. Gone is the innocence, and now the children are quite aware of what's going on and what's going to happen to them in the future. It's important as well that she asks Mrs. Tilscher about what she learned about where babies come from, but Mrs. Tilscher can't answer those questions, and Mrs. Tilscher, her role in Duffy's life is done now, so all she does is smile and walk away. No answer, no clarity. The age of innocence for Duffy is truly over. And similarly, I should say I've skipped over accidentally there. We've got this really important quote here of being untidy, hot, fractious under the heavy, sexy sky. So, as Duffy is untidy, hot and fractious, we can infer that they are experiencing the uncomfortable onset, the beginning of puberty. The word choice of hot and fractious would suggest restlessness and discomfort, and it's also what we call a pathetic fallacy, which is when, in any literature, when the weather reflects the mood. So here a thunderstorm is coming, and so that would suggest difficult, tense, dark times ahead. The next particular mention of the word sexy as well also is a very clear nod and reference to the fact that it's not just the physical growth, but it's the advent of sexual awareness for these kids too. And that is an important change, but it's also potentially quite daunting and intimidating for Duffy at this time. It's not quite comfortable and it's not quite uncomfortable. It's just a little bit in between when I read this poem. Lastly, you ran through the gates, impatient to be grown, as the sky split open into the thunderstorm. We have the continuation of the pathetic fallacy here with the thunderstorm, and this idea that she's running through the gates, impatient to be grown, impatient again suggesting that there's this constant movement and this constant need for it to happen. She's not quite comfortable with it though. And so we've gone through an entire journey in this poem with those first few stanzas of innocence and joy and colourfulness and just protection and safety, to her then being thrust out of the school, through the gates, impatient to be grown and aware of a bleaker and darker and more challenging time ahead. Growing up is difficult. She's leaving an era of innocence to an era of experience in her life. And it's quite wonderfully expressed in this final stanza. And that's it, folks. Hopefully that has been of some help. If you have any questions or you want to have a copy of my slides for your learning or teaching, just drop me an email, please, and I'll be happy to help out. Thank you very much for watching.